In March of 1966, one of the most mysterious air catastrophes in history occurred in Japan. The Boeing, designated by flight number 911, became the center of a tragedy that seems almost too bizarre to be true. After taking off from Tokyo, the plane was on its way to Hong Kong, but just a few minutes into its flight, it began to fall apart midair, as if the sky itself had turned against it. Another minute later, it crashed into the slopes of Mount Fuji, leaving behind nothing but wreckage and unanswered questions. The investigation later revealed that the plane had entered a zone of exceptionally severe turbulence. Not the kind that makes passengers clutch their armrests and reconsider their life choices, but the kind that shreds a Boeing mid-flight. Among those on board, not a single person survived. But 5 lucky passengers at the very last moment returned their tickets, all because they were running late. Among those fortunate 5 were 2 legendary producers, Albert Broccoli and Harry Saltzman, along with director Louis Gilbert, cinematographer Freddie Young, and the production designer of the 5th James Bond film, Ken Adam. Their reason for missing the flight? A perfectly timed distraction. They were attending a live performance by Japan's famed ninjas. If it weren't for the ninjas, the history of the Bond series would have taken a very different turn. But everything worked out. A year later, You Only Live Twice was released, and after that came another 20 films, each one adding to the legend. The total box office receipts of the Bond series, adjusted to today's money, amount to around $20 billion US. That's roughly equal to the GDP of Jamaica or Mongolia. But Bond didn't just dominate the box office, he became the definitive spy of modern history. Direct references to 007 can be found everywhere, from literature to music. While British artist Robbie Williams borrowed the You Only Live Twice theme for his hit Millennium, international stars followed suit. French pop legend Mylène Farmer infused Bond-esque intrigue into her work, Italian singer Gianna Nannini echoed the spy's themes of danger and allure, Soviet-era bard Vladimir Vysotsky dedicated songs to Agent 007, and even Spanish icon Alejandro Sanz wove Bond's signature mystique into his music. And of course, who could forget the unforgettable moment 13 years ago when Bond, alongside Queen Elizabeth II, opened the London Olympics, a scene so iconic it blurred the line between fiction and reality. The special agent has long outgrown the tailored tuxedos and shaken martinis that first defined him. Over the decades, James Bond has perhaps become more influential than the British Queen, Sherlock Holmes, and even the Beatles, though he's never needed a crown, a magnifying glass, or a catchy chorus to cement his legacy. But what few realize is that the adventures of 007, his enigmatic charm, and his razor-sharp wit are more than just cinematic flair. They are, in fact, a self-portrait of a real man, British aristocrat, wartime spy and author, Ian Fleming. In this video, we'll dive into how Fleming's personal drama and espionage career seeped into the DNA of Agent 007, shaping a character who not only mirrored his creator, but was also reshaped by the turbulent history of the 20th century. But Bond isn't just a fictional spy, he's a socio-political phenomenon. We'll explore how Agent 007 reflects the decline of the British Empire, the Cold War tensions between the Soviet Union and the West, and even the evolving waves of feminism. Bond films didn't just entertain, they influenced geopolitics, redefining who the world viewed as the enemy and how that image was constructed, one villainous layer at a time. We'll also peel back the layers of the franchise's staggering success. Who's profiting from this never-ending sequel? What are the clever marketing tricks embedded in every Bond movie that keep audiences coming back decade after decade? And finally, we'll uncover how the creator of this iconic agent, Ian Fleming himself, once worked as a spy in Stalin's Moscow. A plot twist worthy of Bond's own screenplays. Welcome to Double Agent, a channel revealing the truths they don't want you to know or maybe just forgot to mention. The first Bond film, Dr. No, hit theaters in October 1962. The plot unfolded in the sun-soaked paradise of Jamaica, where the villainous Dr. No was busy knocking American missiles, of course, a plotline that at the time seemed like pure fantasy. But fate, as always, has a flair for irony. The creators may have picked the Caribbean setting by chance, but they inadvertently struck the raw nerve of global politics. Less than 2 weeks after the film's premiere, the world teetered on the brink of nuclear annihilation as the Cuban Missile Crisis erupted. Washington threatened to invade Cuba, while the USSR was preparing to launch missiles at the United States. Suddenly, a film about Caribbean missile mayhem didn't feel quite so fictional. Audiences, drawn to the uncanny timing, flocked to Dr. No as if it were the last movie they'd ever see, both literally and figuratively. And who could blame them? If you're going to face global annihilation, you might as well do it with a martini in hand. The result? Box office receipts soared, exceeding the film's modest budget by 54 times. Meanwhile, watching Bond's meteoric rise from the sidelines was a gallant 50-year-old Brit who knew a thing or two about espionage himself. Meet Ian Fleming, a name that sounds like it belongs in a dusty academic journal alongside microbiologist Alexander Fleming, the man who discovered penicillin. But Fleming's contribution wasn't antibiotics. It was lethal charm and a license to kill. Born in 1908 to a Scottish banker and an English noblewoman in the heart of London, Fleming's life was steeped in privilege and power from the very start. His father became a Conservative Member of Parliament at the tender age of 27, while his mother, a high society socialite, boasted lineage that traced back to political royalty. Her grandfather served as an advisor to none other than Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli. Among their close family friends was a young, ambitious politician you might have heard of, Winston Churchill. Yes, that Churchill. Before he was rallying the British public with speeches about fighting on the beaches, he was enjoying tea with the Flemings, likely swapping tales of empire and adventure. Churchill and Fleming's father, Valentine Fleming, weren't just casual acquaintances, they served together in the same elite hussar regiment. In a word, the creator of James Bond was the quintessential representative of old money, the personal vanguard of an empire, which at its peak occupied nearly a quarter of the world's land. From childhood, Ian Fleming was raised not just to exist within this world, but to command it. But when the First World War erupted, Valentine Fleming was mobilized and sent to the front lines in France with his regiment. In May 1917, under relentless German fire, he was killed in action. His comrade Churchill narrowly survived the war and later penned a heartfelt tribute in the Times honoring his fallen friend. Ian Fleming kept that newspaper clipping in his office for the rest of his life, a constant reminder of both personal loss and the fading twilight of the British Empire he had been born to inherit. When his father died, young Fleming was almost 9. He was in prep school and was going to go to Eton College, the most prestigious college in the country. A quarter of British prime ministers over the past 300 years have passed through its walls, but there was a hitch when his father's will was opened. It turned out that he left about 19 million British pounds to his widow and 4 sons, and now, and at that time especially, a huge sum of money. It is hardly surprising that, with such a cushioned upbringing, Fleming's time at Eton didn't quite pan out. But while academic success eluded him, he certainly excelled in living the high life. By 18, he had racked up about a dozen girlfriends and as many incidents of dangerous driving. A year later, His reckless streak caught up with him in more ways than one. He earned a white ticket after contracting gonorrhea and was swiftly discharged from military service. But his mother wasn't ready to throw in the towel just yet. Determined to mold him into something resembling a respectable adult, she leveraged her considerable connections to secure him various positions, whether in the British Foreign Office, journalism, or even banking. In 1933, those connections landed him an assignment with Reuters, sending him to none other than Stalin's Moscow to cover the trial of British engineers from the Vickers Company. They were accused of espionage and sabotage. Ironic, considering the man covering the trial would later become the poster child for fictional espionage. As a representative of the Fourth Estate, Fleming didn't just report the news, he stirred the pot back home. His coverage whipped up enough of a frenzy in Britain that the government imposed a full-blown trade embargo on Moscow. But in classic Bond fashion, everything wrapped up neatly. The engineers, even though some did end up being accused, were released 2 months later, sent back home, and the embargo was lifted. Meanwhile, the Soviets, so preoccupied with prosecuting the British engineers, failed to notice that the real intelligence asset was standing right in front of them. Fleming, an amateur spy before he even knew it, methodically gathered information on how the Soviet state functioned, carefully noting its internal mechanisms, the pulse of daily life, and the ideological machinery that kept it all together. But in true Fleming fashion, simply collecting intelligence wasn't bold enough. The 25-year-old aristocrat decided to go all in. After all, he was officially a journalist. He formally requested an interview with Joseph Stalin. Maybe, just maybe, he'll get lucky. If you're already in the heart of the Soviet Union poking around its secrets, why not see if the man himself has a few minutes to chat? Although Fleming did not expect much of a response, he was amazed to actually receive a personally signed note. It was short, direct, and laced with just the right amount of Stalinist indifference. Comrade Fleming, I apologize. I have no free time. Perhaps another occasion. Of course, there was no other occasion. Stalin had a bit too much on his plate. Famine, purges, industrialization, and the minor inconvenience of consolidating his iron grip on the Soviet Union. Fleming, ever the opportunist, may have not met Stalin himself, but he had gotten closer than most Westerners ever would. Armed with the intelligence he had gathered in Moscow, he marched straight to the British Ministry of Foreign Affairs, not as a hesitant informant, but as a bold initiative taker, fully expecting his findings to be taken seriously. And they were. His report was appreciated, his name was remembered, and 6 years later, when Europe once again found itself teetering on the brink of war, Fleming was sent back to Moscow. Officially, he was just another journalist working for the Times. In reality, he had been given a far more delicate assignment. His mission? To uncover which Soviet troops were stationed where, what they were equipped with, and what the mood was like among officers. His mission? To uncover which Soviet troops were stationed where, what they were equipped with, what the mood was like among officers, and where Soviet allegiances truly lay. How successful he was remains unknown, buried in the murky depths of intelligence archives. But even if his operation yielded nothing, one thing is certain. Attempting such espionage in Stalin's USSR was mortally dangerous. The Soviet Union had zero tolerance for foreign spies, and the consequences of being caught were brutal. Just ask Sidney Riley, known as the Ace of Spies, a British spy, one of the inspirations for James Bond, executed by the Soviets in 1925 after being caught trying to overthrow the Bolshevik government. For Fleming, however, luck, or perhaps sheer audacity, was still on his side. Whether for long or short, his ever-dedicated mother once again secured herself in a comfortable position, this time at the Admiralty, home to the British Naval Intelligence Service. Fleming first joined on a probationary basis, but with the outbreak of World War II, his role became permanent. And just like that, the future creator of James Bond found himself in the service of His Majesty King George VI. Intelligence work suited Fleming perfectly. His journalistic background, natural flair for adventure, and innate talent for scheming made him a standout figure, not only on the battlefield but behind the scenes, as the creative mind of British naval intelligence. However, coming up with audacious secret operations was only half the story. Convincing the authorities to greenlight them was an entirely different battle, one that required charm, persuasion, and a tolerance for bureaucratic traditions. Surely you've heard of Enigma, the infamous German cipher machine, something covered in a previous video. The genius mathematician Alan Turing, the father of modern computing, had spent years trying to crack its code. The British had a ton of captured machines, but they lacked the key ingredient: the German codebooks that contained the actual ciphers. The future author of Bond films devised a plan. His idea? Simple, if not brutally effective. 5 strong men, a German uniform, and a stolen German plane. The plan was to stage a fake crash over the English Channel, somewhere around Normandy, send out an SOS distress signal, and wait for a German rescue ship to arrive. Once the enemy crew came aboard to assist, the British team would kill them all and seize the ship, along with the precious codebooks inside. The operation was given a name fitting its sheer audacity: Operation Ruthlessness. In both strategy and execution, it was practically a James Bond scene waiting to happen. Only in real life, it never made it past the bureaucratic labyrinths of approvals. The plan was debated, delayed, and eventually drowned in paperwork. But if there was one thing Ian Fleming wasn't, it was someone who gave up easily. In 1943, the Allies had driven the Germans out of North Africa. The next logical step, an invasion across the Mediterranean, from Tunisia to Sicily, and straight into the soft underbelly of the Reich. But before launching the assault, they needed to mislead the enemy. And this is where Ian Fleming brought one of his most morbidly creative ideas to life. The plan was simple, brilliantly deceptive, and straight out of a spy novel. Find the body of a man, dress him in a British officer's uniform, attach a briefcase filled with forged documents, and let the current carry him to Spain. Spain, a neutral country with strong Axis sympathies, would inevitably hand the documents over to the Nazis. And that's exactly what happened. Spanish authorities fished out the corpse, debated what to do with it, and, after some nudging, allowed the Germans to inspect the contents of the briefcase. Inside, the documents stated, in clear and unmistakable military jargon, the Allies were preparing to land in Greece. Berlin went into full panic mode. Hitler, in his usual fit of overconfidence, diverted a significant portion of his army to Greece without a second thought. Meanwhile, the real invasion took place in Sicily, catching the Axis forces off guard and securing a crucial victory for the Allies. Fleming's plan had worked flawlessly. It was codenamed Operation Mincemeat, and if this sounds like the perfect spy thriller, you're not alone. Hollywood thought so too. A few years ago, it was turned into a film starring Colin Firth. When he wasn't devising elaborate wartime deceptions, Fleming spent his time attending high-level Allied conferences. At one of these meetings, he found himself in Jamaica, then a British colony. It was love at first sight. He turned to a colleague and made a promise. "You'll see, when this damn war is over, I'll swim, write books, and just have fun." And he did exactly that. After the war, Fleming became a newspaper columnist, and within 2 years, bought an estate in Jamaica, which he named Goldeneye, in honor of his first major intelligence assignment, a contingency plan for defending Gibraltar in case of a Spanish invasion. Every winter, he retreated there, escaping from the dreary British weather in favor of sun-soaked beaches and eventually writing. It wasn't until 1952, at the age of 43, that he finally sat down to write his first spy novel. And for his debut, he drew inspiration from a personal wartime experience. In 1941, on his way back from the United States, Fleming and his boss stopped at a resort town in Portugal for a night of gambling at the casino. There, they encountered a man who seemed like he had walked straight out of a Bond film. Duško Popov, a triple agent working for British, German, and Yugoslav intelligence. A man of wealth, women, and whiskey. He operated under the codename Tricycle. Fortunately not Threesome. Right in front of Fleming, during the game, Duško Popov pulled off a bluff. He casually bid $1 million, a staggering sum at the time, and watched as his opponent, rattled beyond recovery, threw down his cards and surrendered. Of course, Popov wasn't gambling with his own money. The funds came straight from German intelligence. A delightful irony, considering he was working against them the whole time. It was that single moment, that perfectly executed deception, that became the foundation of his very first novel, the one that introduced the world to a character who would define espionage fiction ever since. He titled it Casino Royale. Naming the main character, however, turned out to be a more difficult mission. Fleming agonized over it. The name had to be simple, forgettable, something an undercover agent would wear like a disguise. Let's just say Benedict Cumberbatch or Cillian Murphy were not in the running. Then, one day, inspiration struck, and it had been sitting right under his nose the entire time. Among the many books scattered around Goldeneye, Fleming often found himself flipping through a dry academic text, a guide to the birds of the West Indies. Apparently, a few pages about the scalloped partridges were as effective as melatonin for putting him to sleep. The author? An American ornithologist named James Bond. It was perfect, dull, unremarkable, but with a sharpness when spoken aloud. Fleming took the name, and with it, the legend of Agent 007 began. As Fleming himself admitted, he started to cope with stress, and not the kind cured by a stiff martini. The first major source of that stress was family life. His mistress, who also happened to be the wife of a British MP, got pregnant. To avoid a scandal, she had to urgently divorce her husband and marry Fleming, thus thrusting him into a marriage that was as stable as a house of cards in a hurricane. Neither partner was particularly committed to the concept of fidelity, and both cheated on each other without embarrassment or regret. Fleming's wife wasn't just having an affair with some ordinary bloke, but the leader of the British opposition, a man who, to make matters worse, championed détente and the decolonization of the empire, everything Fleming despised. For generations, his family had worked to expand Britain's global dominance, and now there was some leftist trying to give it all away, while also sleeping with his wife. And that wasn't even the worst of it. Look at the map. By 1952, the British Empire was falling apart. India, the crown jewel, was gone. Britain had withdrawn from Jordan and Palestine, and Africa was consumed by independence movements. But perhaps the most humiliating loss was Egypt and Sudan. In 1956, Egypt's nationalist government seized the Suez Canal, the critical artery of global trade that had long been under British and French control. The expected response? A swift Anglo-French military intervention to take it back. The reality? Total diplomatic humiliation. Except for Israel, no one supported Britain. Not only did the United States refuse to help, but in an unprecedented geopolitical twist, the USSR and the US actually sided against Britain. For the first time in modern history, Britain was alone, and it never quite recovered from the blow. Winston Churchill, in his second term, fought desperately to hold the empire together, but Britain, along with its once mighty global influence, was fading fast. Increasingly, it was looking to America for leadership. While the Nazis were bombing London, the Americans were helping Britain, but on credit. And when the war ended, so did the illusion of self-sufficiency. The Marshall Plan arrived, injecting 45 billion US dollars into British reconstruction, but not as a gift. It came with a bill. Britain had to repay its military debts in full. Well, what else did you expect? Now, picture a cocktail, not a vodka-based martini, something much stronger. Pour into a shaker, a bruised national ego, post-war austerity and rationing, a heavy dose of nostalgia for lost imperial glory, and for extra bitterness, a splash of fatigue and impotence on the world stage. Shake, not stir. Let's call it resentment. And after World War II, despite Britain technically being among the winners, the entire country got hooked on this bitter drink. No one more so than the aristocrats, the former masters of a past life where the whole world was never enough, where conquest, expansion, and dominion were the natural order of things. Now, that world was slipping away, and no amount of gin, tonic, or misplaced optimism could bring it back. Now, imagine being Ian Fleming. You grow up in a superpower where the sun never sets, inherit millions, and assume that, just like your ancestors, you'll live a life of effortless privilege, drifting between well-appointed estate and exotic colonial outposts. Then, the first half of the 20th century smashes through the clock, and everything you thought was permanent collapses before your eyes, as quickly and as spectacularly as Tottenham's annual chances of winning the Premier League, or anything at all. So what do? You build a new world, a world where the British Secret Service is still in control, where America is a helpful but never overbearing ally, and where a suave, impeccably dressed agent can restore order with charm, a Walter PPK, and an unlimited supply of beautiful women and fast cars. That's why in the Bond films, America is never the senior partner. There's no condescension, no rivalry, only a perfectly balanced relationship, where the CIA's Felix Leiter is Bond's equal, his trusted ally. Their very first meeting in Casino Royale set the tone. Leiter casually lent Bond a hefty sum of money, which 007 then used to outplay and ruin Le Chiffre at the casino. The Americans immediately took notice. A year after Casino Royale was published, Bond made his first ever on-screen appearance on American television as an episode of a TV series. It wasn't quite what Fleming envisioned. Instead of the suave British agent he had created, the character was rewritten as Jimmy Bond, an American, while his trusted ally, Felix Leiter, was transformed into Clarence Leiter, a Briton. For Fleming, it was a brilliant PR move, a foot in the door of the American entertainment industry. The first print run of Casino Royale sold just 5,000 copies, but with each new novel, the numbers climbed. 30,000, then 50, then 100. It was a steady rise, but it still wasn't enough. Only Hollywood could give Bond the real push, or if necessary, a good hard kick into mainstream success. In 1960, Fleming decided to take matters into his own hands. He sat down to write an original film script from scratch, titled Ball Lighting. To help, he brought in two co-writers from the film industry, a decision that would come back to haunt him. The collaboration quickly turned sour, and what followed was a long, bitter legal battle over the rights to the plot and characters. The lawsuit dragged on, but Bond's Hollywood debut couldn't be stopped. 5 years later, the film would hit theaters, though under a different title, Thunderball. For its groundbreaking visual effects, it would go on to win an Oscar, one of the only 5 the Bond series would ever receive. A solid third of the film consisted of underwater scenes, an ambitious cinematic risk that holds up surprisingly well today. One of the scenes featured Bond diving beneath the villain's yacht, inspecting its underside before hiding from enemy henchmen. But what most people don't know is that this scene was inspired by a real and rather disturbing incident. In 1956, just before the Suez Crisis, Nikita Khrushchev arrived in Britain on an official visit, but he didn't come by plane or diplomatic ship. He sailed aboard a brand new Soviet cruiser, a clear power move, a not so subtle reminder to Britain, the former ruler of the seas, of exactly where she stood in the new world order. British intelligence, of course, wasn't about to sit back and let this display go unanswered. Without hesitation, they sent in one of their best divers, Lionel Buster Crabbe, to study the vessel underwater, to take a closer look at what the Soviets had brought to British shores. The diver descended into the water and was never seen again. For a full year, there was no trace of him. Then local fishermen made a gruesome discovery: a body without a head, without arms, floating in the sea. He was only identified by his clothes and the scar on his leg. The Soviets, of course, denied everything. What happened to him in the depth of the Soviet cruiser remains unknown to this day. The archives on this case will be fully declassified in 2057, an excellent reason to stick around and see what really went down, if you ask me. Wherever you look, the fingerprints of spies, special operations, and intelligence agencies are all over the Bond franchise. And not just in the stories themselves, but behind the camera as well. While Fleming was busy fighting legal battles with screenwriters, a Hollywood producer named Harry Saltzman reached out to him. At first glance, Saltzman was just another filmmaker with a few solid projects under his belt, but his background was a little more specialized. Before making movies, Saltzman served in the psychological warfare department during World War II. In plain English, what this meant was his job was to craft propaganda, producing leaflets, radio programs, and films designed to break enemy morale. And he wasn't the only one. The Bond screenwriter Richard Maybaum, who went on to write 12 of the films, had an equally fascinating past. During the war, he specialized in morale-boosting films and propaganda newsreels, working his way up to lieutenant colonel in the US Army. Immediately after the war, he wasted no time and wrote his first film, a spy thriller simply titled OSS, named after the Office of Strategic Services, the precursor to the CIA. So what are we looking at here? A film franchise about the world's most famous intelligence agent, built by actual intelligence operatives and propaganda specialists. Did they do this as part of some hidden directive, or was it simply their own natural instinct to shape narratives? That remains unknown, but one thing is certain: many of the key architects of the Bond universe had military backgrounds. For their generation, not serving in the war would have been the strange thing. Even Saltzman's co-producer, Albert Cubby Broccoli, spent 4 years in the Navy during the war. Together, they began assembling a team and securing financing for what would become the first true Bond film. At first, the process was slow, steady, and unremarkable, but then everything changed in March of 1961. That year, Life magazine published an interview with President John Kennedy. When asked to name his top 10 favorite books, Kennedy casually listed Fleming's From Russia with Love among them. In a single night, Ian Fleming went from just a well-known author to a global literary sensation. Suddenly, the most powerful man in the Western world, arguably the only man in history who ever got Khrushchev to blink, was publicly endorsing his work. Hollywood took notice. Production on the first Bond film began immediately. And so, while Fleming was working on yet another novel at his GoldenEye estate in Jamaica, just next door, the very first Bond movie, Dr. No, was being filmed. After the film's premiere, Saltzman and Broccoli realized that they had in their hands a franchise as profitable as a Fort Knox heist. Their next move was obvious: adapt Fleming's most famous book at the time, From Russia with Love. Once again, luck was on their side. The box office for the film exceeded its budget almost 40 times over. In England, the film was released in October 1963, and in America, it arrived 6 months later. But President Kennedy wasn't willing to wait that long. He immediately ordered a copy of the film to be sent to the White House, and he wasn't wrong to be so eager. He watched it multiple times in the following weeks. He arranged his last screening 2 days before his trip to Dallas, from which he would never return. Ian Fleming would outlive Kennedy by only a few months. By August 1964, years of chain-smoking 3 packs of cigarettes a day, heavy drinking, and stress had caught up with him. His heart finally gave out at the age of 56. He died just weeks before the release of the next Bond film, Goldfinger, a film that would set the gold standard for spy thrillers and the entire Bond legacy. Released in 1964, Goldfinger was the film that cemented James Bond as the ultimate pop culture icon. The movie, partially shot at Fort Knox, raked in what would be over $1 billion in today's money. It was after Goldfinger that Time magazine declared Bond the defining hero of the 1960s, and Sean Connery began to resent the role, fearing he'd never escape the shadow of 007. Let's unravel the birthline of Agent 007. James Bond, as we know him today, wasn't fully formed from the start. His biography evolved over time, and in large part, we owe his defining traits to Sean Connery. Originally, Fleming didn't put much effort into crafting Bond's backstory. The character was simply a man of function, an instrument of the state, a cold, efficient weapon in the hands of the British government. No elaborate past, no sentimental baggage. But then came Sean Connery. Fleming, who was initially skeptical about casting a rough-edged Scotsman in the role of his polished English super spy, completely changed his mind after seeing him on screen. Connery's performance impressed him so much that he decided to rewrite Bond's origins to reflect his actor. In the next book, Agent 007's father, Andrew Bond, became a Scotsman from a noble family. His mother, Monique Delacroix, was French-speaking Swiss, and the two met while Andrew was traveling across Europe as a sales representative for Vickers. Yes, that Vickers. The same arms manufacturer whose engineers were tried in Moscow for espionage. James Bond himself was born in Zurich, and at the age of 11 his parents died while climbing the Alps, a loss that mirrored Fleming's own, as he lost his father when he was just a boy. Bond, in many ways, was a literary clone of Fleming himself. This was no accident. Many authors write their main or secondary characters as reflections of themselves, and Fleming was no different. The same adventurer, the same freethinker, the same privileged upbringing followed by a taste for danger. Just like Bond, Fleming didn't graduate from Eton, lost his virginity at 16, and joined intelligence at the start of the Second World War. But while Bond was based on his creator, his physical appearance was different. According to the books, Agent 007 is a tall brunette in his 30s or 40s with strong cheekbones. Fleming once said that Bond looked like both himself and the American composer Joaquin Carmichael. Now let's look at everyone who has played Agent 007 in the movies. In this video, statistics play a rather relevant role because, as they say, numbers often speak louder than words. In over 60 years, 6 actors have taken on the role of Agent 007 in official Bond films. Sean Connery starred in 6 films, George Lazenby in 1, Roger Moore, the most prolific Bond of them all, in 7, Timothy Dalton in 2, Pierce Brosnan in 4, and Daniel Craig in 5. But here's a fact that might come across as rather unsettling. Craig has actually been Bond longer than anyone else, 15 years. His first film, Casino Royale, was released all the way back in 2006. Now, let's talk about the origins of the actors, a true reflection of the British Empire in all its former glory. The role of Bond has been played by 2 Englishmen, a Scotsman, a Welshman, an Irishman, and even an Australian. On average, actors were cast as Bond at 38 years old and left the role at 46. The record holders at both extremes were Lazenby and Moore. The former arrived and departed at the age of 29, while the latter only took the role at 46 and didn't retire from it until 58. Even in his last film, Moore gathered his courage and performed a fire engine stunt without a double. So the real question is, who's the machine here? The Aston Martin or Roger Moore himself? The very first Bond, the legendary Sean Connery, was just 31 when he was cast. At the time, he was a Scottish working-class lad starting out as a milkman, then a bodybuilder, and even a model. For Ian Fleming, an infamous snob, the idea that producers had chosen a former laborer to play his refined aristocratic secret agent was an insult to taste itself. But then, Fleming saw Connery on screen, and suddenly, he wasn't just impressed, he was ecstatic. Connery's Bond was a cunning, ruthless, and effortlessly charismatic man. He was ironic, calculated, and yet undeniably wild, exuding the raw masculinity that defined the early Bond era. Look at how he lights his cigarette in his very first scene, an introduction so iconic that it cemented Bond's presence in cinema forever. By that time, Connery was already exhausted by the role, and the next Bond was an unexpected wild card. The Australian George Lazenby had no experience in cinema, only in advertising. But at his casting, he got into a fight with a security guard, a move that stunned producers in the best possible way. They figured that if he had that much audacity, he might just be the right man for the job. To understand why this approach worked, we need to look at the late 1960s, a time of swinging London, the summer of love, and the rise of the first real youth subcultures. Traditional aristocratic Bond was suddenly out of touch. Hollywood was filled with more straightforward, rugged men. Think Warren Beatty or Michael Caine. The era demanded a simple, effortlessly cool leading man, and Lazenby fit the bill. Despite his inexperience, he took on one of the most tragic stories in the entire franchise. On Her Majesty's Secret Service was the only Bond film where 007 gets married, and in the same film, his wife is immediately killed. It was a bold narrative shift, adding an emotional depth that the franchise hadn't seen before. Then, Lazenby walked away. After just one film, he shocked everyone by leaving the role behind. Was he fired? No. He simply quit. Why? He was afraid to ruin his career. With Lazenby's departure, the Bond franchise had to evolve again, this time adapting to a world that was rapidly changing. Richard Nixon had just become president of the United States, a man who, according to some rumors, had actually visited the Soviet Union as a child. Almost immediately, he began a policy of détente, aiming at reducing Cold War tensions between Washington and Moscow. With the USSR no longer serving as the default villain, Bond's enemies changed too. Gone were the Cold War masterminds. Instead, we got Caribbean dictators and shady Swedish millionaires. The world itself was shifting, and so was the West. Feminism was on the rise. Traditional masculinity was being questioned, and the image of the invincible super macho was starting to feel outdated. That's why the third Bond, Roger Moore, was nothing like Connery or Lazenby. If Connery's Bond was a cunning fox and Lazenby's was a stubborn brute, then Moore was something else entirely. A charming, polished entertainer, the ultimate gentleman spy. His Bond films were more eccentric, lighter, and sometimes downright absurd. His signature facial expression became the raised eyebrow and rolling eyes, always just a little self-aware, always in on the joke. Instead of Cold War geopolitics, the franchise shifted into the realm of pop culture. This was the Bond who ran away from karate fighters, who flew into space, because in an era where Star Wars was breaking box office records, even Bond had to keep up with the times. But after all this farce, Bond needed another reinvention. Timothy Dalton replaced Roger Moore, bringing a stark contrast to the Bond of the previous era. Gone was the eyebrow-raising, light-hearted gentleman. Instead, Dalton's Bond was a grey wolf, reserved, cynical, and caring. The wary glint of someone who had seen too much. He was the romantic from the high road, a version of 007 that felt more grounded, closer to Fleming's original version. But there was something else at play. Dalton's Bond was noticeably less promiscuous. This wasn't just a creative choice, it was a direct response to one of the most urgent crises of the AIDS epidemic. By the early 1980s, the incidence of HIV in the West was rising at an alarming rate. By 1983, talk of an epidemic had begun, and by the mid-80s, it had escalated to a full-scale global crisis. In 1985, immediately after Moore's final Bond film, the disease made its way into Hollywood's inner circles. The first major movie star to publicly reveal his diagnosis was Rock Hudson, who succumbed to the illness within months. At the time, so little was known about HIV that Hudson, after undergoing unsuccessful treatments, was even denied a plane ticket from Paris to Los Angeles. Against this backdrop, Bond's image had to be adjusted. The reckless womanizer of earlier films suddenly seemed out of place in an era dominated by conversations about safe sex and responsibility. Dalton's Bond, whether consciously or not, was less of a playboy and more of a professional killer. But while this iteration of Bond made sense thematically, audiences weren't quite ready for it. The late 80s were still dominated by hyper-masculine action heroes: Schwarzenegger, Van Damme, and Stallone, larger-than-life figures who embodied brute force. Dalton's refined, restrained Bond felt out of step. The box office number declined, and as a result, he lasted just 2 films. Then came the fifth Bond, Pierce Brosnan, the Bond of the millennial generation. Brosnan's 007 was a return to the charisma and suaveness of the Connery era, but updated for modern audiences. Beneath his signature grin, however, was a hidden ruthlessness, a predatory hawk, elegant yet dangerous. His very first scene was already iconic, a breathtaking bungee jump off a dam near Arkhangelsk. A minor geographical issue though, Arkhangelsk is a flat plain just 7 meters above sea level, and the stunt itself was filmed in Switzerland. And if you thought the streets of St. Petersburg and GoldenEye were authentic, well, most of them were actually shot in London, but the scene in Palace Square, that part was real. By 1995, the Iron Curtain had lifted, and it was finally possible to film in the former Soviet Union. Before that, Siberia was Iceland, and Moscow was recreated in Hollywood soundstages. The end of the Cold War reshaped the Bond franchise entirely. Soviet villains were no longer an option. so the threats had to change. Instead of KGB masterminds, Brosnan's Bond took on rogue Soviet weapons dealers, a media tycoon manipulating pitting the West not against the Soviets, but this time the Chinese, a battle over Azerbaijani oil, and the North Korean general scheming to conquer the South. The overarching theme remained the same. Chaos agents trying to upend global stability, but the Soviet Union was no longer the looming spectre in the background. Then came the sixth Bond, Daniel Craig. Craig's Bond was a rebooted archetype of brutal, impersonal, and unrelenting. Fleming's original blueprint was restored, a blind instrument of the state, a weapon that doesn't ask questions but simply does what is necessary. Craig's era began in a world shaped by 9/11, a time of uncertainty and instability. Gone were the self-contained Bond movies with episodic villains. Craig's Bond films were interconnected, forming a continuous narrative rather than isolated adventures. The last of these films, No Time to Die, didn't just tell another Bond story, it was a full exploration of Bond as a character, from beginning to end. For all the changes in actors, tones, and eras, one trait has remained unchanged in Bond's character across 6 decades: the psychology of the lone wolf. Bond knows exactly what needs to be done and how to do it. He doesn't need advice, he doesn't need help, and he certainly doesn't need a team of like-minded allies. For psychologists, James Bond is a textbook case of the dark triad personality traits. First, narcissism. Pride, a lack of empathy, and an unwavering belief in his own superiority. Second, a master manipulator who bends morality to achieve his goals. Finally, psychopathy. Cold-blooded, ruthless, and completely detached from human emotion when necessary. Strip away the tuxedo, the charm, and the smooth one-liners, and what remains is a sanctioned killer, given a license to kill by one of the world's most powerful governments, without trial, without oversight, and without consequences. Which begs the question, why was he always assumed to be the good guy? When Umberto Eco analyzed the Bond books, he was able to sketch out the typical Bond villain like a police photo fit. And the result? Most often, the villain was a nouveau riche, a simpleton who suddenly acquired immense wealth, but without the refinement or breeding out of a true aristocrat. These men always had quirks, obsessions, and personal fixations, and more often than not, serious physical deformities or character flaws. They were frequently from Central or Eastern Europe, the Slavic countries, or the Mediterranean. An unsettling other meant to be as alien as possible to the British audience. To an aristocrat like Fleming, these men were not just dangerous, they were practically subhuman, the kind of people who shouldn't be rich, be powerful, and certainly shouldn't be playing on the same field as British gentlemen. In the films, however, things played out slightly differently. Let's start with motivation. Out of all the Bond villains, 4 of them were primarily driven by revenge. That's not much considering how common the revenge trope is in other franchises. But what about the rest? 10 villains were in it purely for selling weapons, drugs, or other illicit goods, or in the case of Goldfinger, attempting to detonate a dirty bomb in Fort Knox just to manipulate global gold prices. Then there were the truly unhinged ones, 11 villains whose only goal was to sow chaos. They weren't out for profit or revenge, they simply wanted to push superpowers into conflict, reshape the world, or purify humanity. Some wanted to eradicate entire sections of the population, while others, like Gustav Graves in Die Another Day, had the charmingly psychotic ambition of taking over South Korea, using North Korea as a proxy. So, if their motivations are so diverse, who do Bond's villains actually work for? The most famous answer is Spectre, the shadow international organization of terrorists and extortionists. In total, 8 Bond villains were directly affiliated with Spectre, proving that organized evil was one of the franchise's favorite tropes. But here's an interesting detail. Despite what many believe, only one Bond villain ever truly worked for the Soviet KGB. That's right, In a franchise built on Cold War tensions, only one villain acted directly on behalf of the Soviet Union. The other 16 villains, they were freelancers, operating with their own interests, their own agendas, and their own distorted visions of world domination. Which means that while Bond was always framed as a Cold War hero, his biggest threats weren't actually coming from Moscow. They were coming from rogue actors, private warlords, and unaffiliated masterminds. The real enemy was chaos itself. As with Fleming's novels, almost every Bond villain is either a psychopath, there are 8 of them, or physically disabled or injured, of which there are 10. It was never enough for a Bond villain to simply be up to no good. He had to look the part. Preferably, he should be a freak, maybe even a creepy outsider, someone whose very presence was unsettling. And so, physical deformities became a signature trait of Bond's enemies. Most of the time, their injuries were marked right on their faces, burns, scars, or at the very least, a pirate-style eye patch. But some villains had more exotic features. Francisco Scaramanga in The Man with a Golden Gun had a third nipple, because naturally nothing says evil like an extra body part. What's even more interesting, however, is the geopolitical origins of Bond's villains. Despite the Cold War setting, only 5 Bond villains were actually born in the USSR. Even more surprising, the only villain who officially worked for Moscow was Greek. But that's only in the films. In Fleming's books, it was the complete opposite. Across 12 novels and 8 short stories, a clear pattern emerges. 2/3 of all Bond villains were working at the behest of the Kremlin. Sometimes there were actual Soviet intelligence agencies, such as the GRU or KGB, but more often, they belonged to the mysterious SMERSH, a named abbreviation that directly translates to Death of Spies. During World War II, the real-life SMERSH, formed in late 1942, or even earlier, was an elite single Soviet counterintelligence unit operating within the Red Army, Air Force, and Navy with a mission to track down and eliminate traitors, Axis spies, and saboteurs. The organization was legendary in Soviet intelligence circles, and its activities were immortalized in many Soviet-era films, including in August of 1944, based on Vladimir Bogomolov's novel. In reality, SMERSH was disbanded after the war. But in Fleming's alternative universe, SMERSH never stopped operating. Instead, it became a shadowy, ever-present force, waging war against the Western world, and particularly by stealing gold, razing London, and assassinating MI6 agents, all under the direct orders of Moscow. Wherever you look in Fleming's books, there is always a Soviet connection. And that brings us to a key historical context: the circumstances under which James Bond was created. We've already discussed the decline of the British Empire, but there is one more crucial detail. When Fleming sat down to write his first novel, Britain was in the middle of its biggest intelligence scandal, the exposure of the Cambridge Five, a group of British double agents who had been spying for the Soviet Union for over 15 years. The revelation was a national humiliation. British intelligence, once thought to be impenetrable, had been compromised at its highest levels. The royal crown had been deceived, and the world knew it. At the same time, America was undergoing its own crisis. This was the peak of McCarthyism, when Senator Joseph McCarthy was hunting down suspected communists in Hollywood, government agencies, and beyond. The Rosenbergs, a married couple accused of transferring US nuclear secrets to the Soviet Union, were on trial. They were sentenced to death by electric chair in what became one of the most controversial espionage cases in American history. These were the early 1950s, the absolute peak of Western Red Scare paranoia. Fleming wasn't just writing a spy novel, he was crafting a revenge fantasy against the very forces that had humiliated British intelligence and terrified the Western world. But by the mid-1960s, everything had changed. The Soviet Union, while still an ideological enemy, was no longer seen as an imminent existential threat to the West. Instead, a new kind of villain emerged, one that didn't belong to any state at all. The true fear was no longer the Cold War superpowers clashing, it was those who wanted to disrupt the delicate balance between them. And so terrorists, extortionists, and rogue agents became the new Bond villains. And that shift happened for one specific reason: a legal battle over a screenplay. Fleming, as mentioned before, sued the writers of Ball Lighting over the rights to the plot. But it was these very writers who introduced the most enduring Bond villain of all, Ernst Stavro Blofeld, and his organization Spectre, the Special Executive for Counterintelligence, Terrorism, Revenge, and Extortion. And in English, Spectre means ghost, even if it wasn't the ghost of communism that haunted Bond. Their signature emblem, a ring with a special octopus, a symbol of an organization that has its tentacles everywhere. The film producers immediately seized on this imagery. From the very first Bond movie, they simply replaced Smersh with Spectre, swapping out Cold War politics for a more timeless, global enemy. For Fleming, the Soviet Union was the ultimate villain, with a capital E for enemy. But the film producers had no interest in staying stuck to geopolitics. They pivoted fast, inventing new adversaries to keep Bond fresh and profitable, which would have made Fleming roll over in his grave. Here are two examples of this. First, in 1977's The Spy Who Loved Me, the entire script was written from scratch, leaving nothing but the title from Fleming's original book. The plot: Bond teams up with a Soviet intelligence officer to take down a villain who wants to wipe out humanity on land and create an underwater civilization. At the end, the final scene ends in bed. Curtain. The film was a reaction to the Helsinki Agreement, the peak of détente between the superpowers. Then came the second moment. In A View to Kill, Bond is awarded the Order of Lenin, one of the highest honors in the Soviet Union. The same award was given to Kim Philby, the notorious leader of the Cambridge Five, who betrayed Britain by spying for the Soviets for decades. That's right, James Bond was now standing in the same league as Fidel Castro, Georgy Dmitrov, Kim Il-sung, and Walter Ulbricht, all previous recipients of the Order of Lenin. At this point, one could almost track the state of relations between the USSR and the West by the content of Bond films, whether they were improving or deteriorating, a delicate synchronization with diplomacy. In the late 70s, another crisis arose against the backdrop of missile deployments across Europe, and right at that moment, the script for Octopussy was in development. In its earliest version, a certain Soviet general wasn't just planning to seize Western Europe, he intended to stage a coup and assassinate Brezhnev. The plot was so bold that it even had Bond flying a supersonic Tu-144 to Moscow to save the General Secretary himself. This storyline was eventually scrapped, but even in the final version of the film, the actor playing the nameless Soviet General Secretary bore a striking resemblance to a certain real-life figure. So why is that supposedly anti-Soviet films never painted the USSR in solid black paint? There is no evidence that someone from above ordered Bond producers to soften or harden their portrayal of the Soviets depending on the political climate. The reason for these sudden tonal shifts is much simpler and far more cynical: money. Outright anti-communist films rarely performed well at the box office. Take Silk Stockings from 1957, the post-war Hollywood remake of a pre-war film, Ninotchka, starring Fred Astaire, a story about the ruthless Soviet commissars facing off against noble Western producers. And yet, despite all its Cold War messaging, it barely broke even. What makes it even more ironic is that the film was directed by Ruben Mamoulian, a Moscow State University law graduate who had emigrated to the United States in the early 1920s, a man who escaped the Soviet system himself. Silk Stockings wasn't a gripping espionage thriller. It was a light-hearted musical comedy aimed at the widest possible audience. But it turned out that this kind of Cold War satire wasn't something that truly captivated viewers. To create a massive global hit, something more universal was needed: a villain detached from any one country, ideology, or government. Not the KGB, not the Chinese, but a force that always wants evil and always commits evil. Not a state-backed adversary, but rogue masterminds, mercenaries, and shadowy organizations. The kind of villains who threaten to blow up the chessboard on which the superpowers divide their spheres of influence. Reason number 2, you won't believe it. It's money again. Producers Harry Saltzman and Albert Broccoli had a very specific dream: to screen Bond films in the Soviet bloc, a huge, untapped market with hundreds of millions of potential viewers. But there was one major problem. Few people want to watch a movie where the main villain is from their own country. Hollywood has always been pragmatic about geopolitics, adjusting its narratives to protect access to key markets. Just look at how today's film industry navigates its relationship with China. A perfect example: Disney's live-action remake of Mulan, designed specifically for the Chinese market, filmed with Chinese actors in a Chinese setting, and yet the film flopped internationally due to the COVID-19 pandemic. But even then, 2/3 of its total box office revenue still came from China. Hollywood has always known how to cater to a global audience without alienating lucrative markets. Unfortunately for Saltzman and Broccoli, their grand plan never worked in the Soviet era. Not a single Bond film was ever officially released in the USSR until the end of the Cold War. But unofficially, the video rental shelves in Soviet cities were bursting with pirated Bond tapes. For decades, Bond was a forbidden Western indulgence, passed around through underground VHS markets. And then, in January 1996, when GoldenEye finally received an official release in Russia, and subsequently in other former Soviet states, something remarkable happened. It immediately topped the box office. After years of watching Bond in secret, the audience rushed to see him on the big screen. Nothing personal, just business. Quite recently, in 2023, Finnish scientists completed a massive study: firm growth and profitability, the role of age and size and shifts between growth profitability configurations. They analyzed nearly 70,000 companies covering 1/8 of all businesses in Finland to determine the key factors behind success and failure. Their research identified the key pattern. Businesses that prioritize profitability over rapid expansion tend to have greater long-term stability. Those that consistently maintain high margins create a financial buffer, allowing them to adapt and grow over time without being crushed by rising costs. This approach is precisely what has sustained the Bond franchise for over 6 decades. The earliest films delivered astonishing returns, making back their production costs 40 times over. Over time, the return on investment gradually declined to 10 times, then 7, and now somewhere between 3 to 5 times the budget. Not a single one of the 25 Bond films has ever failed at the box office. The trend is clear when looking at the ratio of ticket revenue to production budget. The 1970s marked the first major drop in profitability, followed by a revival, then another decline. However, the franchise never slipped into financial failure. Shifting the focus to absolute box office revenue, a new pattern emerges. With Sean Connery's departure, audience interest took a hit. Over the following 5 decades, box office numbers steadily climbed, eventually returning to previous levels. Meanwhile, production costs, excluding inflation, remained stable for years. This changed dramatically in the 1990s, when the industry's demand for high-end special effects and A-list actors led to soaring expenses. Connery started with $1 million paycheck, eventually reaching $10 million per film. Moore and Dalton earned similar salaries, but by the time Brosnan and Craig took over, lead actors were commanding $30 to $50 million per film. By the late 1990s, the most expensive Bond film up to that point was Moonraker, a project that almost derailed the entire franchise. After the massive success of Star Wars, Bond producers scrambled to capitalize on the space craze. Instead of producing a planned spy thriller, they rushed a new script into development, sending Bond into orbit. The result was a bloated production, a twice-blown budget, and a box office return that failed to justify the cost. The film did not flop, but the franchise never made the same mistake again. Avoiding box office dependency became a priority. The solution was simple: find additional revenue streams. For the past 30 years, every Bond film has recouped its production costs before even hitting theaters, thanks to product placement deals. Marketing experts estimate that over 6 decades, the Bond franchise has generated around $7 billion through brand partnerships alone. Unlike most franchises, Bond's luxury product placement is integral to its identity. A detective like Sherlock Holmes or a fantasy saga like Harry Potter can exist without branded products. Even franchises like Star Wars or the Avengers rely primarily on fictional worlds rather than real-world consumer goods. Bond, however, is different. Even for casual viewers, the association is instant. Aston Martin, Rolex, Omega, tailored suits, expensive cocktails. The franchise's product placement evolved over time. Connery's Bond wore Rolex, but by the 1990s, Omega secured exclusive rights. The Aston Martin DB85 became a cultural icon, while Bond also drove BMWs and at one point a Ford Mondeo, because Ford paid for the privilege. In the 1960s, Bond films featured around 5 major brand placements per movie. Today, that number has exploded to over 30 brands per film. Some brands have appeared more often than others. Rolex and Omega, two competing Swiss luxury watchmakers, each appeared in 9 films, with Rolex dominating the early era and Omega taking over in the 1990s. Aston Martin and Smirnoff Vodka appeared in 12 films each. Though Aston Martin initially resisted collaboration, the automaker saw no connection between their sports cars and the Hollywood franchise until Goldfinger propelled Aston Martin DB5 to worldwide fame. The most featured brand in the Bond universe is Bollinger Champagne, appearing in 15 films. Unlike other brands, Bollinger's presence is woven subtly into the films. It never dominates a scene with blatant product placement, yet its bottles are always strategically positioned, whether in a villain's hideout, a high-stakes poker game, or a romantic interlude. A perfect example of Bond's influence on branding is Barbour, a British company specializing in waxed jackets traditionally associated with country life, fox hunting, and rowdy football hooligans. The brand was never a staple of high fashion. Then, in Skyfall, Daniel Craig's Bond appeared wearing a Barbour jacket. Within days, the product sold out worldwide and resale prices tripled overnight. Luxury fashion and high-end goods are the only industries benefiting from Bond's marketing machine. The beer giant Heineken paid $60 million to sponsor Skyfall. This was not just a few sips on screen, it was a full-scale global marketing campaign, where Bond's endorsement became the centerpiece of Heineken's branding strategy. Unlike most franchises, Bond barely needs to spend on marketing, because sponsors do the job for them. Product placement isn't just an extra revenue stream, it has become a defining feature of the franchise. The roots of the strategy trace back to Fleming himself. As an Eton-educated aristocrat, he constructed Bond's world through meticulous details, from the brands he used to the drinks he ordered. The term for this is name dropping. A person doesn't simply say, "I had dinner in Paris." Instead, it's "I had dinner at Le Maurice sipping Chateau Lafite while discussing hedge funds and the future of luxury markets with Bernard Arnault." All the Aston Martins, Rolexes, Bollinger Champagnes, and Tom Ford suits, Fleming wasn't just showing off. For him, these brands were more than status symbols. They were a reflection of his nostalgia for a world that was disappearing. The old aristocratic order, the empire, the glamour of post-war Britain, and with it, a passing world. Now, the Bond franchise faces its most significant reboot yet. The final film of the Craig era placed a definitive end to his version of 007. Over the decades, the Bond series has embedded itself deeply in global culture. Nearly half the world's population, over 4 billion people, have watched at least one Bond film. That includes not only casual moviegoers, but some of the most powerful figures on the planet. The influence of the franchise extends beyond entertainment, with intelligence agencies once studying Bond films for inspiration on special operations, gadgets, and espionage tactics. The cultural impact of Bond has blurred the lines between fiction and reality. Fleming's nephew once wrote that President Kennedy asked his uncle about how one might orchestrate a coup in Cuba to remove Castro, as if a novelist could provide an actionable blueprint for regime change. The Bond mythos shaped public perceptions of intelligence work, turning spies into hyper-competent, well-dressed lone wolves who could single-handedly dismantle global threats. After 9/11, part of the American public genuinely questioned why a single elite agent couldn't be sent to the mountains of Afghanistan to eliminate Osama bin Laden. In the postmodern era, Bond has been deconstructed and reimagined multiple times. Parodies like Austin Powers and Johnny English exposed the absurdity of the Bond archetype, while serious alternatives such as Kingsman played with its tropes, reworking them for a modern audience. Bond is no longer the unapologetic, womanizing, detached government weapon of the past. Over time, he has evolved into a character with vulnerability, emotional depth, and personal stakes. The transformation is best encapsulated in the 1995 reboot, where Judi Dench's M introduces herself to Bond with an instantly iconic line.
Because I think you're a sexist, misogynist dinosaur, a relic of the Cold War.
And yet, Bond persisted. Born from the shadow of World War II and molded by Cold War anxieties, he adapted to a world that kept shifting under his feet. As the Berlin Wall fell and new global conflicts emerged, Bond didn't fade into irrelevance. History never ended. New enemies arose, new battles had to be fought. If Bond is a relic, he is not a relic of just the Cold War, but of something much older. Bond represents the last bastion of the British Empire, a world where a single British agent could still shape global events, where the Union Jack remains synonymous with power, prestige, and espionage excellence. This idea was symbolically captured in The Man with the Golden Gun of 1974. The film features a scene where MI6's Hong Kong headquarters operates from inside the half-sunken wreck of the RMS Queen Elizabeth, once the largest and most luxurious passenger ship in the world, now a rusting relic. The ship's real-life fate mirrors that of the British Empire itself. Originally, Queen Elizabeth was a symbol of British dominance, but in the jet age, it became obsolete. It was sold to an American investor, then a Hong Kong businessman, each attempting to repurpose it as a floating hotel or university. Before those plans could materialize, a fire broke out on board, and the ship was run aground. 3 years later, it was dismantled for scrap. In Fleming's world, Britain was the center of everything. In the real world, its geopolitical power faded. And yet, British culture, Bond, the Beatles, the Queen, the English Premier League, Mini Cooper, Lord of the Rings, and Harry Potter became a dominant global force. At the heart of it all, still standing tall in a tuxedo, is James Bond. James Bond, who at the time this video is being recorded, is searching for a new digital passport. Not only are the producers hunting for the next actor to don the iconic tuxedo, but with Amazon's soon-to-be-announced acquisition of MGM Studios, Bond now has a new home on Amazon Prime. This deal, valued at a staggering $8.5 billion, gives Amazon the rights to the entire Bond catalog and opens the door to fresh possibilities, from exclusive streaming releases to potential spin-offs, and even Bond-themed original series. While the future of 007 might involve more screens than silver, one thing is certain: wherever Bond goes, adventure, intrigue, and a martini, shaken, not stirred, are sure to follow. Before wrapping up, consider supporting the channel by expressing your likes, dislikes, or more extensive opinions in the comment section, and sharing the video with those who might enjoy it. And now, it's time for a book raffle. And this one is dedicated to Ian Fleming himself. The World Is Not Enough is a biography that delves deep into Fleming's life, his work, and the real-world events that shaped 007. To participate, you have to first subscribe to this channel, and second, comment below your real-life story from your experience that is worth a spy action movie. Maybe you accidentally locked yourself out of your apartment and had to climb through your neighbors or scale a balcony to get in, or you accidentally picked up the wrong briefcase at an airport and discovered something inside that shouldn't have been there. The author of the most original, gripping, and uninvented story, one that feels like it could have been lifted straight from a spy novel, will win a copy of The World Is Not Enough. And that's it for now. A new video is already on its way. Take care, and until next time.